This week on Capital Connection, the annual report card for public schools in Illinois is out. We sit down with State Superintendent Dr. Tony Sanders to talk about the results.
Overall, it's a step in the right direction. We still have a long way to go as a state.
And gun owners are confused about the state's new registration system for assault-style weapons. Illinois State Police have 2 months to clear up the confusion.
I foresee this being a huge problem in the state of Illinois. When the Illinois State Police are still discussing what needs to be registered and what doesn't, and we're in November already.
And lawmakers return to Springfield next week for the last days of veto session. Legislative staffers are hoping they get their chance to unionize.
If this is the path the parties want to go down, they would need special legislation.
It's all coming up on Capital Connection.
From the Illinois State Capitol Rotunda, Capitol Bureau Chief Cole Hankey is asking the tough questions. This is Capital Connection.
Welcome to Capital Connection. I'm Cole Hankey. This week, the state report card for public schools across Illinois came out, and joining us now to discuss it is Dr. Tony Sanders, the state superintendent. Thank you so much for joining us again.
It's my pleasure to be back again, Cole.
All right, so we saw this report card. It showed some trends moving upwards, some improvements for schools, proficiency gains across the state. We also saw some lingering effects of the pandemic. Overall, what did you think of what this report showed?
Overall, it's a step in the right direction. We still have a long way to go as a state, but this was really a return to what looks to be more normalized data. So we're almost back to pre-pandemic rates of students being proficient in English language arts, almost the same rate for math, and things like graduation rate and others really, we saw some acceleration that was significant. Probably one of the biggest positives of this was we saw some closing of gaps for African American students on almost every metric, which is a step in the right direction. But again, still a long way to go.
How did those gaps, specifically those racial gaps, get impacted by the pandemic? We obviously saw education levels drop, but was it greater for those populations as well? And was the recovery happening at a quicker pace or at the same pace as everything else?
So we've not researched to see exactly what happened. I have some, my own hypothesis is that we received a lot of additional funding from the federal government. The state's evidence-based funding formula passed, which has driven resources to support the students who need it the most, which includes our African American and predominantly impoverished neighborhoods. And so I think it's the investments that we made to really help in the recovery of students across the state.
Just overall, is this where you would want to see the state coming out of the pandemic, where education was impacted so greatly?
Again, we will always have room to grow. This is a step in the right direction. It is positive movement for the state. I think school districts should be proud of the work that they have done, and teachers should be proud of the work that they are doing. But we still have room to grow, obviously. If you were to look at the results of third graders as they entered the pandemic to where they were in 7th grade when they took this assessment, they grew over those years. So if you look at it by cohort data of students that actually moved through our system, they grew over time. So that's a positive trend, considering the fact that we did have that blip of a couple years of changed instruction.
That's interesting that you bring up that third grade area, but the part that I thought was really interesting about this report, especially at the high school level, was this is the students that are graduating high school this year were the ones that started, during they had the COVID pandemic hit during their senior year. And how have those results really been impacted by that, and especially when we're talking about them wanting to make that next step, maybe to college, community college, any sort of higher education or career field?
So our graduation rate was the highest of 13 years. So I think it really drives home the message that our students are resilient, and they came back and were ready to finish up and graduate and move on to college. Our college going rates have not changed. We continue to see about 65% of our kids go off to college and be successful. And so I think it really demonstrates the resilience of our students. And so I think it says volumes about the work that our teachers did, working in collaboration with their students to get them through high school.
One of the probably sore spots of this report card was the high rate of chronic absenteeism.
Yes.
I believe it's right around that 30% of students in the state were chronically absent. And chronically absent, that's 2 weeks, right? Or that's 3 weeks of missed school days, right? It's 10 days?
10 days.
Okay, so 10 days of missed school. we're out of the remote learning. We're out of the, oh, I just didn't get on my laptop at home era of education. Are you surprised that this number is remaining this high when, students are back in the classroom and they have to report to school?
So no, I'm actually not surprised. I think, first of all, you see this as a national trend. It's Colorado, Ohio, every state is being impacted if you read stories about chronic absenteeism. That's one metric that every state shares in common. The way it's calculated is the same across every single state. And it is 10 days of missed school, regardless of reason. So there's a couple factors you have to think about as it relates to chronic absenteeism. In the midst of the pandemic, the state passed a new law that allows students to take up to 5 days for mental health purposes. That counts as chronic absenteeism. If a kid takes their 5 mental health days, that counts towards their chronic absenteeism. The other thing is, during the pandemic, we handed every kid a device and said, you're going to start learning from home. And teachers are still offering many lessons. They're offering a lot of the curriculum online, especially in middle and high school. And so as students, much like them seeing their parents sometimes working remotely from home, they think that they can also work remotely from home, and they'll have access to the curriculum from their teachers. So I think I'm not surprised at it. It's something we need to continue to address. We certainly want kids in school every day, but we have to recognize we change the conditions in which kids are learning during the pandemic, and some of them are struggling to return to that in-person environment.
There are still requirements for if a student gets COVID too, right? If they have to be out a certain number of days, they're asked to quarantine a certain number of days. Does that count to that as well? I mean,
It could, but our testing for COVID is also dropped. We're not compelling people to do the COVID testing the way that we were doing. So if a student is identified as having COVID, certainly they should stay home, follow the protocols of staying home for 5 days, and then masking for another 5 days. But we're also not seeing students tested at the same rates as they were before. So, but certainly illness will continue to count towards that as well.
every spring in this building, there always seems to be probably 10 bills that pop up, and they're not gimmicks by any means, but they're new approaches or changes to the way that education happens, or certain policies are put in place that are supposed to help raise these standards. And I wonder how much those changes maybe affect education rather than just, or is it mainly budgetary? You've already mentioned the investment of the evidence-based funding model and things like that, and that obviously has a big, helps those schools, especially along those racial lines that we addressed earlier as well. How important is, how big of an impact are the budget investments that are going into education actually having on these kinds of reports?
Oh, so budgetarily, I can tell you as a former district superintendent that I came to be the state superintendent by way of the state's second largest school district, where I was a superintendent for almost a decade. In that position, I came from a district that made, if it had not been for evidence-based funding passing in 2017 and implemented in 2018, we would not have survived the pandemic. We would not have had the resources to provide one-to-one devices for kids. We wouldn't have had the nurses available, the social workers available. So the investments the state continues to make in evidence-based funding are transforming public education in this state in a positive way. The policies that we are talking about at the state level, I think probably one of the biggest ones that you're going to be hearing about more and more frequently is the standard to which we hold our students. And not really the standard. In Illinois, currently, to be considered proficient at the high school level, we set a bar that's above what the College Board says is required to get into college. And so that's one policy consideration, along with something that you and I have talked about before, which is how we identify schools for supports. How do we determine how a school is commendable or a school that's exemplary? The process by which we follow policy-wise is really difficult for the general public to understand when it comes to labeling of schools and what that means.
So when we're talking about the money that goes to this, this has now been going on since 2017, so we're going on 6 years, I guess, of evidence-based funding increases for school funding. Is there a lagging indicator aspect to that? And the effects of the budget from last spring obviously will hit school districts this year, but as far as translating to the students, are you expecting is the idea that the investments will have an effect much later down the road, especially after the pandemic, where so much of these levels got hit.
Yeah, it would be. It's unfortunate that we did have the pandemic that interrupted what would have been a good, probably a really decent source of data for some sort of a study to see the impact of evidence-based funding. I think as we continue to move forward and we stabilize in the wake of the pandemic, certainly the intention and the intentionality of that evidence-based funding formula is to make sure we're driving resources in a way that we believe will impact student outcomes. So you are seeing some of that in this year's report card. Increased graduation rate, the highest in 13 years. Even though it's still high, chronic absenteeism coming down a little bit. 9th graders on track is at an all-time high. 8th graders taking algebra is at an all-time high. Students taking career and technical education courses and completing them is at an all-time high. So we're seeing a lot of growth in a lot of different measures on the state report card. And I do relate all of that back to the investments the state has made in the evidence-based funding formula.
I want to shift topics real quick because we also heard just a couple of weeks ago, Governor Pritzker made his pitch for an entirely new state agency, taking things off the plate of 3 other state agencies, including yours, the State Board of Education, and creating this new agency totally dedicated to early childhood. And I wonder, it's going to be sort of the idea is it'll launch out of ISB, I guess. It'll be supervised under the ISB umbrella, but what role are you going to have going forward in this, and why is this a good idea going forward?
So the governor's office actually had a commission, the legislature had members on this commission looking at early childhood across the state, because we continue, as you know, under the Smart Start plan of investing another $75 million a year over year in early childhood has been the governor's priority. There was a report several years ago before I took this position that said that it's a challenge for providers, for daycare providers, for public schools to navigate the different systems and streams of funding related to early childhood, and it's also difficult for parents to navigate. If you have a small child, there's 3 different agencies that you might have to interact with, and it's a maze trying to get through the 3 different agencies to figure out where can I get child care provided for my child. And so the idea behind it was to consolidate this into one standalone agency. Other states have done this. New Mexico recently converted to a similar agency. So it's not unheard of, and it's a step in the right direction to make sure that we're properly serving our youngest learners and making sure families don't have to go all over the place to figure out how they access early childhood for their kid. So that's the premise behind it. It's going to take us a couple years to do it, but certainly we're going to partner closely with the governor's office. The person leading the transition work will work collaboratively, working directly for me, but working with the governor's office as well to lead this effort.
Especially in the launch of this, we're likely going to hear a lot of budgetary talks around this. And there's no doubt going to be questions of, if we're going to take all of this from 3 different agencies and put it into one, why couldn't it all just fit under the ISB umbrella? Why couldn't daycares be lumped into the State Board of Education? Is that too much? Is that just totally out of the realm of the State Board of Education in that way to handle that aspect of it?
No, it wouldn't be out of the realm, but I think that the intent, I don't know that you could get to the same impact as you would if you created a standalone agency that really focuses on early childhood education. We have 123,000 kids currently in early childhood, and that doesn't even scratch the surface in terms of the need for early childhood across this state. We have deserts everywhere. This is the one area that is not a compulsory school age, right? You're talking about students where families choose to put their child into one of either a daycare center or early childhood program, or the child qualifies for some educational need. So it is a niche area when you're talking birth to age 5 that it's best to just really consolidate and really ensure that it's a seamless transition between an early childhood system that serves all families into a K-12 system that also is here to serve all families.
All right, well, Illinois State Superintendent Dr. Tony Sanders, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much.
All right. When we come back, we take a look at the many questions that gun owners have about the state's new registration system that officially kicks in on January 1st. We'll be right back.